In this video, I'll talk about the books that made a difference for me this year. Hi, I'm Øystein and I talk about books. So this is not actually a top 10 books of 2022 or something like that. This video is about the books that have made the biggest impact. And some of you might object to me making this video right now because the year hasn't ended yet. But with these books I'm talking about today, I sort of have to have a bit distance to understand what they actually mean to me, so it wouldn't have mattered if I recorded this video in 3 weeks or so. And again, it's not likely that these books will end up on my top 10 for this year. With the exception of one. You can take a guess in the comments if you like to. All this to say that there is a huge difference between the books I give 5 stars to versus the books that I think about all the time and that impact me in my everyday life. Useful books, you might say, in a sense. I think I'll get to it, and towards the end I'm also going to try to summarize what these books might have in common. We'll start off by the book that I wanted to tell people I've read the most, and that's Kristin Lavransdatter by Sigrid Undset, one of our most famous Norwegian both authors and novels. And this chunky book consists of 3 books, and if the first one had been a separate one in my shelf, probably that one could have ended up on my top 10 this year. This one is set in the Middle Ages Norway, and it's about Kristin and her life, and the central themes are love, God, and being a woman, I would say. And I actually think I was a bit overwhelmed by reading this novel, not just because of the size, but also that it's such an important piece of the Norwegian heritage. And this is something I thought I would never say, and I didn't think that actually would have an impact on me at all, because I'm not very nationalistic, to say the least. Since some of those scenes in that novel took place a couple of 100 meters from where I lived before, it just made it more real in a sense, and I could imagine myself being a part of the first book, especially more than I've done in any novels, I think. Even though I've read books from Oslo, Norway before, it just did it in another way. Maybe because most of the things that remained from that time are ruins, so I only had the landscape and my imagination to go on, and historical sites on the internet, which I googled a lot during my read. You might say that after I finished reading it, I've just been reminded of that novel constantly. Also, I might just have been a bit proud of reading a book that's over 1,000 pages when I finished it, because that didn't seem realistic before 2022 started. So it's about 1,200 pages with all of them, but if you'd like to read it, you can read the first one, and you can stop there if you want to. The first one is the best one, and then the third one is better than the second one, at least. I should also mention that Kristin is a powerful character that's hard to forget, and reading 1,200 pages of any book will make it stick more. So whereas Kristin Lavransdatter felt very close, the next one is the opposite, and that's Americanah by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And this was one of the biggest surprises of 2022. It's about 2 Nigerian teens that move from Nigeria to the US and the UK. Femlu starts studying at Princeton, and her boyfriend Obinze should go after her, but since 9/11 happened, he can't enter the US and he starts working in the UK. The story mostly follows Femlu. She starts a blog in the US, and it's about racism, because racism wasn't something she was familiar with before she started studying in the US. Before I started reading this novel, I thought I knew a lot about racism, but after I finished reading it, I wasn't so sure, because it was really great at putting racism into terms that I could understand. That might seem odd, but the perfect example is how the author describes hair. As you might have guessed, hair isn't really that important to me, and it's something I haven't thought about that much. But in this novel, she goes through it in steps. Firstly, when she comes to the US, many people want to comment her hair, and then they likely want to touch her hair because it's so exotic. Then she goes to the hairdresser, where they have a lot of opinions if she has the correct Nigerian hair or the correct American hair. And all this combined makes you really understand how small things over and over again can be very, 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 very annoying and problematic. If someone asked me if they could touch my hair, I would likely say yes. I would be a bit weirded out, but I would likely say yes if they were really persistent. But it wouldn't have been the same thing at all, and this novel just shows you why. But it's not just the smaller things. This novel also discusses systemic racism. And the novel is set up in a good way because our two main characters have two very different starting points, which just enhances the experience and makes it more nuanced reading about it. Also, the gender difference makes a huge role in this one as well. So of course I recommend this one as well. This is likely to be my most useful read of this year. Number 3 on this list is a book that I've talked about several times after I finished reading it, because it surprised me a bit how much I kept thinking about it, and I still do. That doesn't necessarily mean that I want to read it again, but I wish I read it differently the first time I read it. And that's Independent People by Halldór Laxness. This is one of Iceland's biggest authors and has also, as Sigge Undset, won the Nobel Prize for Literature. This one is set in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It's about Bjartur, a sheep farmer on Iceland. He's a stubborn and proud man, and he's fought for his independence for 18 years. And it's an epic tale about the changes that goes through Bjartur, but also the Icelandic society. When I first started reading this novel, the language felt quite archaic, but after a while I sort of started enjoying it. I just started enjoying it a little too late. If I were to decide to read this novel again, I would probably read it in Norwegian instead of English. I think there are two main reasons of why I keep on thinking about this novel. The first thing being that it has one of the most intense, not birthing scenes, but child is coming to life scenes I've ever read, and also the theme of timelessness, because these classic books really often have a timeless theme that will keep on lasting forever. Bjartur isn't the man of the late 1800s, he is a man of the eternity. We all have a Bjartur in our lives, not maybe as extreme as Bjartur always, but sometimes yes. When I read this novel, I was just astounded of how well the landscape is described, the houses they live in, the weather. It's all very gritty, and it feels so soothing, calming in a way. I don't know if you have the same feeling, but if I read a novel where the landscape is so vividly described together with nasty weather, I feel a bit of calm sitting inside and reading it. It sort of makes it better. Of course, Laxness is a brilliant author, even though I can't understand always why I like it so much. And if I were to be pretentious, I would say that this novel is bigger than me, in a sense. I don't get why I liked reading it, but I liked reading it even though I gave it 3 stars. Sometimes it was a bit slow, but when you read a novel and 8 months later you just can't forget it and keep on thinking about it and even recommend it to people, there has been something in the way it's written that just will live with you forever, I guess. I'll make a new video in 80 years. I think we'll move over to something a little bit more light, and that's what I talk about when I talk about running by Haruki Murakami. This is one of those books that just changed my view on myself as a reader. After I read this one, I thought now I can read about authors writing about themselves. Of course, I've read non-fiction before, authors writing about the topic, but never really them writing about themselves. And I just loved this one. Murakami focuses on his running and writing, but it's all tied up to his running, because that's something he does quite a lot. I truly loved this novel. I do like to run, so it's not that I don't like the topic, but it's just written in such a engaging way. Of course it's short, that's something I often tend to like. He just ties it so well together with his life philosophy, which is interesting. It does help that it's a bit strange, a bit out of the ordinary, and also that he's really brilliant, smart. This one just opened my eyes to a whole new world of literature, which is why it's on the list and why it's made an impact. The book itself isn't so impactful, it's more what it did to me as a person. It made me read this one, for example, which I also loved. And recently I ended up finishing the last book in my Struggle series by Karl Ove Knausgård. So that was about 140 hours of listening to Knausgård talking about himself. I do not think that would have been possible without Murakami's book. Also, I almost directly went out and bought these ones. So, have not read any of these yet, but it's safe to say that I will probably read more of Murakami's books next year. Or I hope so, because otherwise this would have been stupid. Also, what I talk about when I talk about running is partially set in Hawaii, where Murakami lives part of the year, so the scenery is quite slow and comfortable, you might say, which does help when I'm thinking back on that book. The last novel on this list is the book I spent the most time reading this year. I think I've spent more than 2 months trying to read it. And trying to read it is the keyword here, because it is a gruesome read. It's The Unwomanly Face of War by Svetlana Alexievich, also a Nobel Prize for Literature winner. And the reason for why this is on the list is quite simple. It's about the women that fought for the Soviet Union during the Second World War. And it's just painful. Probably the most painful book I've ever read. The reason being that the stories are unfiltered and many of them contain children and babies. And the worst thing is that after I bought this book, a new war has started here in Europe. And many of the women in this novel are from Ukraine, and Ukraine is probably the most central place in this book. And just thinking about this happening once more it's just hard to think about when you get the personalized stories from these women. Made me sort of want to give up thinking about these things just reoccurring all the time, even though humans know how terrible these things are. There's no doubt that I will remember this book for a long time, and that's why it's on the list. Also, I wanted you to know that it's out there, but it's not for the faint-hearted. So all of these books made a huge difference for my reading this year, and that's why they're on this list. It's not easy to see that all of these books have something in common, but the thing I realized was how much I either love or hate classics. 2 of my worst reads this year has been Frankenstein and Mrs. Dalloway, whereas 2 of these classics I really enjoyed and will probably take with me forever. So there's a huge difference there. It's not easy for me to be indifferent about classics, but maybe that's one of the qualities they have. Also, I would say it's easier for non-fiction to fit into this category I'm talking about today, because if something really has happened, it's easier for that thing to make an impact. I just think that in some way the world is worse than fiction ever could be. That was really dark, but in a sense I really think it is. My last point in this video is that all of these books I've talked about today feels like I read a long time ago. It's something about books that you really enjoy or makes an impact. It feels like they've been there for a while, or forever. I don't know exactly why that is, but it's very apparent that that's something I'm feeling about these books. And I wouldn't have thought that any of these books would have ended up on this list when I started this year. It's not easy choosing books, but sometimes you get lucky. Thank you for watching this video. If you have read a book that you feel was very impactful, please comment below. And if you just have recommendations for books, you can also comment them below. I hope you have a nice day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!